Welcome to a journey through one of history's most haunting mysteries, where we will walk gently through the ruins of a forgotten world, a civilization so advanced, so interconnected, so seemingly permanent, that its sudden disappearance still echoes across 3,000 years of silence. Tonight we step into the year 1200 BCE, to a Mediterranean world that glittered with bronze and possibility, where great kingdoms traded goods and ideas across vast distances, where palaces rose in stone splendour, and where scribes recorded the daily business of empires in scripts that would soon be forgotten for millennia. Picture the eastern Mediterranean on a warm evening in the late Bronze Age, perhaps in the year 1225 BCE. The sun sets over waters that connect rather than divide, casting golden light across shipping lanes where merchant vessels have travelled for generations, from the Aegean to the Levant, from the Nile Delta to Anatolia. A web of civilization spans the ancient world complex, sophisticated and seemingly unshakable in its permanence. This is a world that has existed for centuries in recognizable form, where kingdoms rise and fall, but the fundamental structures of Bronze Age civilization remain constant. Palaces administered by literate bureaucrats, trade networks carrying tin and copper to be alloyed into bronze, diplomatic marriages linking royal houses, treaties written in cuneiform and hieroglyphics, all of it speaks of a mature, stable system that appears destined to continue indefinitely into the future. Yet within a single human lifetime, all of this will vanish. Palaces will burn, cities will be abandoned, writing systems will be forgotten, trade networks will collapse, and the eastern Mediterranean will descend into a dark age from which it will not fully emerge for 3 centuries. How this happened, why it happened, and what it meant for the people who lived through it are the questions we will explore together in the coming chapters. But first, we must understand what was lost. We must walk through this glittering Bronze Age world at its height, meeting the civilizations that seemed so permanent, understanding the systems that connected them, appreciating the sophistication they achieved. Only then can we truly comprehend the magnitude of what disappeared when the Bronze Age ended not with a whimper, but with fire and silence. The Mycenaean citadels, Bronze Age Greece. Picture the Greek mainland in 1225 BCE, where hilltop citadels rise above fertile valleys, their massive stone walls speaking of both wealth and fear. These are the strongholds of Mycenaean civilization. Mycenae itself, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes' palace centres that rule territories through hierarchical systems of administration that the later classical Greeks will have entirely forgotten. Imagine approaching Mycenae in the late afternoon light, when the sun illuminates the famous Lion Gate, with its carved guardian beasts watching over the entrance to the citadel. The walls themselves cyclopean masonry so massive that later Greeks will believe only mythical giants could have built them, speak of engineering, sophistication, and organized labor on a scale that requires complex social organization. Pass through the gate and enter a world of Bronze Age luxury. The palace at the citadel's heart contains spacious megaron halls where kings receive visitors and conduct the business of state. Frescoes decorate the walls with scenes of warfare and hunting, processions and religious rituals executed in the vivid colours that Mediterranean peoples have favoured for millennia. Storage rooms hold enormous pithoi ceramic jars taller than a person, filled with wine, oil, grain, all the wealth that flows to the palace from the surrounding countryside. But perhaps most remarkably, the palace contains something that later Greeks will lack entirely: a writing system. Picture the archive room, cool and dim, where clay tablets covered in linear B script record the daily business of palace administration with bureaucratic precision. Lists of offerings to the gods, inventories of bronze weapons and wheels and vessels, assignments of rations to workers, records of textile productions, all the mundane details that keep complex societies functioning, preserved in the clay tablets that archaeologists will discover 3,000 years later, perfectly preserved by the fires that destroyed the palaces they documented. The script itself. Linear B represents an adaptation of an earlier Cretan writing system to record an early form of Greek. Picture the scribes who created these records, specialists who spent years learning the complex syllabary, who served the palace administration as essential record keepers in a world where memory alone could not track the complex flows of goods and labour that sustained Mycenaean civilization. Beyond the palace walls, the countryside supports this administrative centre through agricultural production organised by the palace system. Picture villages where farmers work land allocated by palace authorities, where craftsmen produce goods according to palace specifications, where the population accepts hierarchical organisation in exchange for the security and prosperity that Mycenaean civilization provides. The Mycenaeans are traders and warriors both. Their pottery, distinctive stirrup jars and other forms appear throughout the eastern Mediterranean, evidence of commercial networks that carry Mycenaean goods to Cyprus, the Levant, Egypt, and beyond. Their warriors, equipped with bronze armour and weapons, ride in chariots and fight with the aristocratic warrior culture that will later be remembered, dimly and imperfectly, in Homer's epics about Achilles and Hector. Far to the east, across the Aegean and into the heart of Anatolia, another great Bronze Age civilization holds sway. Picture the Hittite Empire at its height, controlling vast territories from its capital at Hattusa, a city of temples and palaces, fortifications and administrative archives, perched in the highlands of central Anatolia. The Hittites are perhaps the Bronze Age's most formidable military power. Picture their armies on campaign-disciplined infantry supported by chariot forces, siege equipment for reducing enemy fortifications, supply trains that allow operations far from home territory. Their military success rests partly on innovation. The Hittites are among the first to master ironworking, though bronze remains the primary material for weapons and tools throughout their empire. But military might is only part of the Hittite story. Picture the royal archives at Hattusa, where thousands of clay tablets written in cuneiform record not just palace administration, but something more sophisticated: international diplomacy conducted through formal treaties and correspondence between great powers. The Hittite kings write as equals to the pharaohs of Egypt, arrange diplomatic marriages with Babylonian princesses, negotiate with the kings of Assyria over spheres of influence and trade rights. These diplomatic records reveal a world of surprising complexity and interconnection. Picture the Hittite king receiving a letter from his brother, the Egyptian pharaoh, complaining that the gold sent as tribute was insufficient, or requesting physicians to treat an illness that Egyptian medicine cannot cure. The kings address each other with elaborate courtesy, while carefully negotiating the interests of their respective states, maintaining a balance of power that has kept major warfare in check for generations. The Hittite capital itself reflects imperial power and wealth. Picture Hattusa's massive fortifications with double walls with towers and gates, protecting a city that sprawls across hillsides and valleys. Within these walls stand temples to Hittite gods, administrative buildings where scribes maintain records in multiple languages, residential quarters for nobles and craftsmen, all the infrastructure of a Bronze Age capital administering an empire. Yet despite their power, the Hittites face persistent challenges. Picture the northern borders where tribal peoples constantly probe for weakness, the western frontiers where Mycenaean influence competes with Hittite interests, the vassal states that must be managed with a mixture of force and diplomacy to maintain their loyalty. The empire requires constant attention, constant resources, constant vigilance to maintain. To the south, the Nile flows as it has for millennia, sustaining a civilization that by 1225 BCE is already ancient beyond the imagination of other Bronze Age peoples. Picture Egypt under Ramesses II, the great pharaoh whose reign represents perhaps the last flowering of New Kingdom power and prosperity. The Egypt of this era is a land of monumental architecture and artistic sophistication. Picture the temples at Luxor and Karnak, vast complexes where columns rise like stone forests and walls are covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions and painted reliefs depicting pharaohs' victories and religious devotions. Picture Abu Simbel in Nubia, where colossal statues of Ramesses guard a temple carved into living rock, announcing Egyptian power to the southern frontiers. But Egypt is more than monuments and royal grandeur. Picture the Nile Valley itself, the narrow ribbon of fertility that makes civilization possible in the midst of desert. Villages line the river, their fields greening with crops nourished by the annual flood. Irrigation systems, refined over millennia, distribute the Nile's waters with sophisticated engineering. Granaries store surplus that feeds not just farmers, but the specialists who create Egypt's material culture. Potters and weavers, metalworkers and jewelers, scribes and priests, all the occupational diversity that complex civilization requires. Egyptian administration rivals any Bronze Age bureaucracy in its sophistication. Picture the scribal schools where young men learn hieratic script, the cursive writing used for administrative documents, and the complex accounting procedures that track taxation, labour obligations, temple offerings, and all the other flows of goods and services that the state must monitor. The records these scribes produce on papyrus, sadly, most lost to time and moisture, document a society of remarkable organisational complexity. Egypt in this period remains a major player in Bronze Age international relations. Picture the pharaoh's court receiving ambassadors from Hatti, from Babylon, from Mycenaean Greece. Egyptian gold, legendary for its abundance and purity, flows to foreign courts as diplomatic gifts and trade goods. Egyptian grain feeds populations in less fertile regions. Egyptian artistic styles influence the material culture of peoples around the entire eastern Mediterranean. Yet even mighty Egypt faces challenges. The Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders who appear in Egyptian records as threats from the north, have begun probing Egyptian defences. The cost of maintaining monumental building projects and military establishments strains even Egypt's resources. Ramesses II will be succeeded by rulers of declining power, presiding over an Egypt that remains wealthy and sophisticated but faces an uncertain future. In the river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, Civilizations that are ancient even by Bronze Age standards continue patterns established millennia earlier. Picture Babylon under the Kassite dynasty, a city whose name already carries weight of immemorial tradition, where temples rise on foundations laid in the dawn of written history. Babylonian civilization represents continuity more than innovation by this period. Picture the scribble schools where students still learn cuneiform writing in its classical forms, copying out texts that date back 1,000 years or more. The literature preserved in these schools includes not just administrative and legal texts, but works of imagination. The Epic of Gilgamesh, myths of creation and flood, wisdom literature, mathematical and astronomical texts that reveal sophisticated understanding of natural patterns. To the north of Babylon, Assyria emerges as a rising power. Picture the Assyrian heartland around the cities of Assur and Nineveh, where kings are building the military traditions that will eventually make Assyria the dominant power of the region, though that dominance still lies in the future. The Assyrians of 1225 BCE are traders and warriors both, maintaining commercial networks that extend from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf, while defending their territories against raids from mountain peoples. The entire region participates in Bronze Age international trade networks. Picture caravans carrying lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, tin from somewhere in Central Asia, its exact source still uncertain even to modern scholars, cedar wood from Lebanon, textiles and metalwork from specialized production centers. These trade goods move along routes protected by international treaties, through markets where merchants from different cultures meet and exchange not just goods, but ideas, technologies, artistic styles. What unites all these civilizations, Mycenaean, Hittite, Egyptian, Mesopotamian and others, we haven't mentioned, like the Cypriots, the coastal cities of the Levant, the smaller kingdoms of Syria, is their participation in what scholars call the Bronze Age international system. Picture this system as a vast web spanning the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, connecting civilizations through multiple overlapping relationships. Trade forms the most obvious connection. Bronze itself, the alloy of copper and tin that gives this age its name, requires international trade because tin is rare and its sources are distant from the major Bronze Age centres. Picture the supply chains that bring tin from Central Asia or Europe to mixing with copper from Cyprus or the Levant, then distribution of finished bronze as ingots and objects throughout the Mediterranean world. But trade involves more than metals. Picture merchant ships laden with diverse cargo, Cypriot copper, Mycenaean pottery, Egyptian gold, Syrian textiles, timber from the Lebanese coast, grain from Egypt and the Black Sea coast, wine and oil in great ceramic vessels, luxury goods like ivory and precious stones. Each ship represents not just commercial exchange but cultural contact, the spread of ideas and styles and technologies across political boundaries. Diplomacy connects the great powers in a system of mutual recognition and negotiated relationships. Picture the diplomatic correspondence preserved in clay tablets, letters between kings addressing each other as brother, negotiating marriages between royal houses, exchanging gifts that are simultaneously personal and political statements, requesting trade goods or military assistance, complaining about insults to dignity or violations of agreements. This diplomatic system includes protocols that would seem familiar to modern diplomats, ambassadors who represent their kings in foreign courts, negotiated treaties that establish spheres of influence and mutual defense obligations, gift exchanges that maintain relationships and demonstrate wealth, even the concept of international law that governs relations between states. Cultural exchange flows along the same routes as trade and diplomacy. Picture artistic styles spreading across the Bronze Age world, Egyptian motifs appearing in Mycenaean art, Aegean pottery shapes influencing Cypriot ceramics, Near Eastern cylinder seals found in Greek contexts. Religious ideas, mythological narratives, technological innovations all move through these networks of contact and exchange. The palace scribes who maintain administrative records often learn multiple languages and scripts. Picture a scribe at Ugarit, a cosmopolitan port city on the Syrian coast, who might need to read Akkadian cuneiform for diplomatic correspondence with Mesopotamian courts, Egyptian hieroglyphics for contacts with the pharaoh's administration, and the local alphabetic script for domestic records. This multilingual literacy reflects a world where international contact is routine, and sophisticated systems have evolved to manage it. Perhaps most importantly, the people of the Bronze Age world have every reason to believe their civilization will continue indefinitely. Picture a Mycenaean noble in 1225 BCE looking back over several centuries of palace civilization in Greece, seeing the massive fortifications that protect his citadel, observing the administrative systems that function with bureaucratic regularity, and participating in trade networks that have operated for generations. Why would he imagine that within his own lifetime all of this will end? Picture a Hittite scribe recording a diplomatic treaty with Egypt, writing the cuneiform characters with practiced skill, filing the tablet in an archive that contains generations of similar documents. The formula of the treaty references precedents from earlier reigns, assuming continuity of political structures and international relationships. The future seems predictable. More treaties, more diplomatic correspondence, continued participation in the Bronze Age international system. Picture an Egyptian overseer organizing the harvest, using administrative procedures refined over centuries, recording the results in hieratic script on papyrus, forwarding reports to higher authorities through established bureaucratic channels. The harvest feeds a population that trusts in the eternal cycle of Nile floods and human agricultural labor. The gods maintain cosmic order, the pharaoh maintains earthly order, and civilization continues as it always has. Yet beneath this appearance of stability, vulnerabilities are accumulating. Picture the complexity of the systems that sustain Bronze Age civilization. The long supply chains bringing tin from distant sources, the administrative overhead required to maintain palace bureaucracies, the military expenses of defending far-flung territories, the potential for cascade failures if multiple stresses hit simultaneously. The Bronze Age world is in some ways a house of cards, magnificent in its construction, but vulnerable to shocks that might topple the entire structure. The palace systems that organize production and trade create efficiency, but also fragility. If the palaces fall, so do the systems they maintain. The international trade networks that bring prosperity also create dependencies. If trade routes are disrupted, civilizations lack essential resources. The interconnection that allows ideas and goods to flow also means that crises can spread rapidly across the entire system, and so we leave this Bronze Age world at its height, sophisticated, interconnected, confident in its permanence. In the chapters to come, we will watch as this entire system unravels with shocking speed, as palaces burn and cities fall, as writing is forgotten and trade networks collapse, as the eastern Mediterranean falls. But the catastrophe still lies ahead. For now, in the year 1225 BCE, the Bronze Age world glitters in the Mediterranean sun, its peoples going about their daily lives with no conception of the silent collapse that approaches like a shadow from the future. Now picture a palace workshop on a warm afternoon, where craftsmen transform raw materials into the metal that defines their age, bronze, that miraculous alloy whose properties enabled warfare, agriculture, art and trade on a scale previously unimaginable. The soft glow of the furnace illuminates faces intent on ancient work, while the ring of hammers on metal creates a rhythm as old as civilization itself. In the creation of bronze, we discover not just a technological achievement, but the foundation of an entire world, its power structures, its economic systems, its artistic achievements, and ultimately, its vulnerabilities. Picture a copper ingot being prepared for smelting one of those distinctive oxhide-shaped bars that appear throughout Bronze Age contexts, their form so standardized that they serve almost as currency across the Mediterranean trade networks. The copper glows red as craftsmen heat it in charcoal-fueled furnaces that reach temperatures carefully calibrated through generations of metallurgical experience. But copper alone, while useful, is relatively soft for tools and weapons. Picture a copper blade that bends in use, that requires constant resharpening, that cannot hold an edge through the rigours of battle or agricultural work. Ancient peoples knew copper for millennia before the Bronze Age, yet it was the discovery of bronze, copper alloyed with tin, that transformed human civilization. The addition of tin, typically about 10 to 12% of the final alloy, creates something remarkable. Picture the moment when molten copper and tin combine in the crucible, swirling together to form bronze that, when cooled and worked, proves harder than either component alone. This bronze can be cast into complex shapes, hammered into thin sheets, sharpened to edges that hold through use, crafted into objects both functional and beautiful. The properties of bronze made it ideal for Bronze Age needs. Picture weapons forged from this alloy, swords that could slash and thrust without breaking, spear points that could penetrate armour, axes that could fell enemies or trees with equal efficiency. Picture agricultural tools, ploughs that could break heavy soils, sickles that could harvest grain, axes for clearing forests, all enabled by bronze's superior hardness and durability. Picture also the artistic possibilities bronze enabled. The metal could be cast using the lost wax process, creating sculptures of remarkable detail and beauty. It could be hammered into sheets and worked into vessels, armour, decorative elements for palaces and temples. It could be engraved, inlaid with precious materials, transformed into objects that demonstrated both technical skill and aesthetic vision. Yet here lies the fundamental vulnerability that will help unravel Bronze Age civilization. Tin is rare. Picture the geography of the Bronze Age world, where copper deposits are relatively common. Cyprus, Sardinia, Anatolia, the Sinai. But tin sources are distant and uncertain. The exact origins of Bronze Age tin remain debated even by modern scholars, though sources likely included Afghanistan, Central Asia, perhaps Britain and Iberia, possibly even Southeast Asia. Imagine the complexity of the supply chains that brought tin to Bronze Age centres. Picture caravans travelling for months across mountains and deserts, merchant ships sailing to distant coasts, middlemen and traders handling the precious metal at each stage of its journey. Every bronze object in the Mediterranean world embodied this vast network of exchange, this intricate web of trade relationships that spanned thousands of miles. The scarcity of tin meant that bronze remained a valuable commodity, never common enough to be used carelessly. Picture a palace treasury where bronze objects are carefully inventoried, where broken tools are melted down and recast rather than discarded, where the metal itself represents stored wealth that can be transformed into weapons when needed, tools when useful, or luxury goods for trade and display. This dependence on distant tin sources created both the necessity and the framework for the international trade networks that characterized Bronze Age civilization. Picture the diplomatic correspondence between kings, where requests for tin appear alongside demands for gold and luxury goods. The great powers understood that maintaining access to tin supplies was essential to maintaining military power, agricultural productivity, and the material culture that defined civilized life. The production and distribution of bronze, along with other essential resources, was organized through palace-centered economies that represented the Bronze Age's characteristic form of social organization. Picture the palace not just as a royal residence, but as the administrative and economic heart of a Bronze Age kingdom, a complex institution that organized production, collected and redistributed resources, maintained craft specialists, and recorded all of this activity in detailed written archives. At Pylos in Mycenaean Greece, at Hattusa in the Hittite heartland, at countless other Bronze Age centres, palaces functioned as sophisticated economic enterprises. Picture the archive rooms where scribes recorded everything. Lists of bronze weapons stored in palace arsenals, inventories of bronze vessels and tools issued to craftsmen, records of bronze collected as taxation and tribute, accounts of bronze distributed as rations or payment for services. The Linear B tablets from Mycenaean palaces reveal this system in remarkable detail. Picture a scribe recording the distribution of bronze to smiths. To the smith Alcoitus, 3.5 kilograms of bronze for spear points. To the smith Casaminos, 2 kilograms of bronze for sword blades. Every kilogram is accounted for, every craftsman's output monitored, every finished weapon inventoried and stored. This administrative control extended beyond bronze to encompass all aspects of economic life. Picture palace officials managing textile production by palace women, organizing agricultural labor in palace-controlled fields, overseeing herds of sheep and goats whose products fed palace industries. The tablets record thousands of workers, shepherds and farmers, weavers and potters, smiths and carpenters, all participants in economic systems organized and documented by palace bureaucracies. The efficiency of these systems was remarkable, but so was their centralization. Picture the palace as a single point of failure. If the palace falls, if the archives burn, if the administrative apparatus collapses, the entire economic system it organizes unravels. The very sophistication of palace administration created vulnerability alongside efficiency. At the apex of Bronze Age society stood warrior aristocracies whose power rested on their monopoly of bronze weaponry and their mastery of the most sophisticated military technology of the age, chariot warfare. Picture an elite warrior in full bronze panoply, helmet, cuirass, greaves, protecting his shins, a great bronze sword at his side, bronze-tipped spears in hand. This equipment represented enormous wealth. Picture the resources required to equip a single warrior. The bronze itself sourced through long-distance trade, the skilled craftsmen who forged and fitted the armour, the time required for the warrior to train rather than engage in productive labour. Only palace economies could support such specialists, creating a military aristocracy whose power derived from palace resources and reinforced palace authority. The chariot, supreme weapon system of Bronze Age warfare, required even greater resources. Picture the chariot itself, a light, fast vehicle drawn by specially bred horses, carrying a warrior and his driver into battle. The construction of a chariot required master woodworkers, metal workers for the bronze fittings and wheel rims, leather workers for harnesses, horse trainers to prepare the animals. A chariot and team represented the ancient equivalent of a modern tank, expensive, requiring specialized support, devastating in battle when properly deployed. These warrior elites dominated Bronze Age artistic representations. Picture palace frescoes showing chariot hunts and battles, seal stones depicting armed warriors, bronze figurines of soldiers in full armour. The art celebrates martial prowess, aristocratic competition in hunting and warfare, the glory of military achievement that justified elite status and palace wealth. Yet this military system, impressive as it was, also created vulnerabilities. Picture the expense of maintaining chariot forces and bronze-equipped infantry, the need for constant access to tin for weapon production, the requirement for palace administrative systems to organize and supply military forces. When palace systems failed, the military forces they supported could not long survive. The wealth generated by palace economies and secured by bronze-armed warriors manifested in cities of remarkable sophistication and beauty. Picture Mycenae in its glory. Approach through the famous Lion Gate, its massive fortification walls speaking of both wealth and anxiety. Within the citadel, the palace complex contains throne rooms and administrative chambers, religious shrines and residential quarters, storage facilities holding the accumulated wealth of the kingdom. The architectural achievement of Bronze Age cities remains impressive even by modern standards. Picture the great palaces with their sophisticated construction. Ashlar masonry where carefully cut stones fit together without mortar, drainage systems that managed water flow, multiple stories connected by stone staircases, rooms arranged around central courtyards that provided light and air. The palaces were decorated with frescoes of vivid colour and sophisticated composition. Picture walls showing processional scenes, nature motifs of dolphins and flowers, geometric patterns of spirals and rosettes, hunting scenes and religious ceremonies. These paintings, executed in fresco technique on wet plaster, represent not just artistic achievement but cultural confidence, the willingness to invest resources in beauty rather than mere functionality. Beyond palaces, Bronze Age cities contained temples where gods received offerings and oracles delivered prophecies, workshops where craftsmen practiced specialized trades, residential quarters for populations that included palace dependents, free citizens, and slaves. Picture the bustling life of such a city, merchants arriving with goods from distant lands, farmers bringing produce to palace storehouses, craftsmen working in specialized quarters, priests conducting rituals in sacred spaces. The cities were connected by roads, sometimes paved, that facilitated movement of people and goods. Picture these routes marked by way stations and fortified points, maintained by palace authorities who understood that communication and transport infrastructure served both economic and military purposes. The Bronze Age world was networked, connected, more cosmopolitan than the later Dark Age would be for centuries. The wealth concentrated through palace systems supported remarkable artistic and cultural achievements. Picture the delicate gold death masks found in Mycenaean shaft graves, their craftsmanship revealing sophisticated metalworking techniques and aesthetic sensibilities. Picture the exquisite jewellery gold rings engraved with miniature scenes of ritual and mythology, beaded necklaces of gold and semi-precious stones, intricate gold work showing mastery of granulation and filigree techniques. Bronze Age craftsmen excelled in multiple media. Picture ivory carving plaques and figurines showing Asian elephants or African savanna elephants, evidence of long-distance trade networks bringing exotic materials to Aegean workshops. Picture stone vessels carved from marble, alabaster, and other fine materials, their thin walls and precise forms demonstrating patient craftsmanship. Pottery reached high levels of achievement. Picture Mycenaean palace-style jars decorated with Octopian argonauts, their naturalistic rendering showing keen observation of marine life. Picture the standardized shapes that appear throughout the Mediterranean, stirrup jars for transporting precious oils, craters for mixing wine, kylixes for drinking, each form refined through generations of pottery production. The artistic achievements extended to literature, though most has been lost. Picture the palace bards whose poetry celebrated royal ancestors and mythological heroes, whose songs preserved cultural memory and aristocratic values. The later Homeric epics, Iliad and Odyssey, likely preserve distant echoes of Bronze Age poetic traditions, transformed through centuries of oral transmission, but retaining memories of a vanished world of bronze-armed heroes and palace civilizations. Religious life flourished with its own artistic expressions. Picture the sacred spaces where Bronze Age peoples worshipped, natural caves and springs, mountain-top sanctuaries, palace shrines decorated with religious symbols and offerings. The material culture of religion included clay figurines of deities and worshippers, bronze ritual vessels, seal stones showing religious scenes, all speaking of spiritual lives that found expression through material beauty. Perhaps most remarkably, Bronze Age civilizations were literate societies where writing served both administrative and cultural purposes. Picture the various writing systems in use across the Bronze Age world. Cuneiform in Mesopotamia and its sphere of influence, hieroglyphics in Egypt, Linear B in Mycenaean Greece, the alphabetic script developing at Ugarit, each system adapted to record different languages and serve different purposes. The archives these writing systems produced provide our most detailed evidence for Bronze Age life. Picture the clay tablets from Pylos, baked hard by the fire that destroyed the palace, preserving detailed records of the palace's final year. Lists of personnel assigned to various tasks, inventories of weapons and vessels, records of religious offerings, assessments of land holdings, all the bureaucratic detail that makes palace economies function. Some texts preserve more than bureaucratic records. Picture the diplomatic correspondence between great kings, written in Akkadian cuneiform that served as the international diplomatic language of the age. Letters requesting military assistance, complaining about insufficient gifts, arranging royal marriages, discussing commercial matters, all revealing a sophisticated system of international relations. Religious and literary texts appear as well. Picture the mythological narratives preserved on tablets from Ugarit, stories of gods and heroes that share themes with later Greek and Hebrew traditions. Picture the medical texts, the astronomical observations, the mathematical calculations, all demonstrating that Bronze Age literacy served intellectual and cultural purposes beyond mere accounting. Yet the dependence on writing, like dependence on bronze, created vulnerability. Picture the specialized training required to master complex writing systems, the institutional context where literacy was learned and practiced, the administrative structures that required and maintained writing. If these institutions collapsed, literacy could vanish with them, as indeed it did across much of the Bronze Age world. Standing in a Bronze Age palace in 1225 BCE, surrounded by the accumulated achievements of centuries, participants in this civilization had every reason to believe it would continue indefinitely. Picture a Mycenaean king looking back over generations of his ancestors who ruled from this same palace, who left records in the same script, who participated in the same international systems. The future must have seemed like an extension of the past. More palaces, more trade, more bronze weapons and beautiful art, continuity stretching forward as it had stretched backward. The massive fortifications that protected Bronze Age cities spoke of expectation of continuity. Picture the enormous investment in walls that would take generations to build, designed to protect cities for centuries or millennia to come. The effort invested in such construction only makes sense if builders expected their civilization to last. The careful recording of administrative details in durable clay tablets suggests similar expectations. Picture scribes filing tablets in carefully organized archives, creating systems where documents could be retrieved and consulted years or decades later. This only makes sense if they expected the administrative system they documented to continue functioning. The training of specialized craftsmen, bronze workers, fresco painters, seal carvers, scribes represented investment in the future. Picture apprentices learning complex skills over years of training, masters passing down techniques refined through generations, all assuming that their specialized knowledge would remain valuable and their institutional contexts would persist. Yet beneath this appearance of permanence, vulnerabilities were accumulating. Picture the complex supply chains bringing tin from distant sources. What happens if those routes are disrupted? Picture the centralized palace systems organizing economic life. What happens if palaces fall? Picture the interconnected international system where kingdoms traded goods and ideas. What happens if multiple kingdoms fail simultaneously? The Bronze Age world was a magnificently sophisticated house of cards, each element supporting others, creating resilience through interconnection, but also potential for cascade failures. The very features that made Bronze Age civilization impressive, its bronze technology, its palace economies, its international trade networks, its military systems, its literate administration, also made it vulnerable to systemic collapse. Picture the Bronze Age world at its absolute peak, perhaps around 1250 BCE. Palaces stand secure behind massive walls. Scribes record the flow of goods with bureaucratic precision. Bronze workshops turn out weapons and tools in steady streams. Merchant ships ply familiar routes carrying standardized cargoes. Diplomatic correspondence maintains relationships between great powers. art and architecture reach sophisticated heights. Everything speaks of a mature, stable, enduring civilization. No one knows that collapse is approaching. Picture the daily life of Bronze Age cities, children playing in palace courtyards, craftsmen working bronze in palace workshops, farmers bringing tribute to palace storehouses, scribes recording it all in careful detail. Every day resembles the day before. Every season follows familiar patterns. Every generation assumes the next will inherit the same world. The bronze that gives this age its name gleams in afternoon sunlight on warriors' armour, in palace treasuries, in beautiful vessels and jewellery, in the tools that cultivate fields and build cities. This miraculous alloy has enabled everything they have achieved. It seems as permanent as the massive stone walls, as enduring as the palace bureaucracies, as reliable as the international trade networks that have functioned for generations. Yet within a few decades, it will all be gone. The palaces will burn, the cities will be abandoned, the writing systems will be forgotten, the trade networks will collapse. The Bronze Age world that seems so permanent, so sophisticated, so destined to continue, will vanish so completely that later generations will remember it only in myths and legends, dimly and imperfectly, as a heroic age of greater power and glory than their own diminished world can achieve. But that catastrophe still lies ahead. For now, bronze gleams, palaces stand, scribes write, and the illusion of permanence remains intact. As the years passed, the small band of knights who once guarded pilgrims began to change. What started as a humble order soon drew the attention of kings, nobles, and the church itself. With the Pope's blessing, donations of land, money, and manpower poured in, and the Templars grew into one of the most powerful institutions of medieval Europe. They were no ordinary knights. Each man swore vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, living as both warrior and monk. By day, they marched beneath the blazing sun, armoured and ready to defend Christian lands. By night, they prayed in silence, their chants echoing through stone chapels. Theirs was a life balanced between the sword and the spirit. But with power came wealth, and with wealth came influence. The Templars owned lands across Europe, built fortresses in the Holy Land, and acted as early bankers, safeguarding the fortunes of kings and pilgrims alike. Their banner, stark black and white, became a symbol of both fear on the battlefield and respect in courts across Christendom. Yet whispers grew in the shadows. Some claimed the order kept secrets, tales of forbidden rituals, hidden treasures, and even heresy spread quietly from mouth to mouth. True or not, these rumours wrapped the Templars in a cloak of mystery that would one day help seal their fate. By the early 1300s, their fortunes began to fade. The Crusades had failed, and the dream of holding Jerusalem was lost. No longer essential, the Templars became vulnerable. King Philip IV of France, drowning in debt to them, saw his chance. With a single command, he moved to destroy them. On the morning of October 13th, 1307, the Kingdom of France awoke to a chilling sight. Templars across the land were seized at once, accused of blasphemy, heresy, and dark rituals. The arrests shocked Europe. In the prisons of France, torture awaited them. Many confessed under unbearable pain. Whether the words were truth or lies mattered little. The confessions fueled the trials that followed, each one more damning than the last. Despite their pleas of innocence, the order was condemned. Pope Clement V, pressed hard by King Philip, officially dissolved the Knights Templar. Their castles, their lands, and their fortunes were seized, their legacy shattered in the eyes of the world. But the final chapter came in Paris in 1314, as Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Order, was led to the flames. As the fire rose around him, he is said to have cursed the king and the pope, calling them to meet him before God's judgment within the year. Both men did die soon after, and the story of his curse lingered like smoke through the centuries. The Templars were gone, but their shadow never faded. Whispers of hidden treasures, secret knowledge, and unseen heirs haunted the imagination of Europe. And so, long after their order was dissolved, their legend lived on, a mixture of history and myth, forever woven into the fabric of the past. And so, the tale of the Templars closes not with swords clashing on distant battlefields, but with fire and silence in the heart of Paris. A brotherhood erased by kings and popes, yet remembered through whispers and legends. History is filled with endings like this, sudden, brutal, and yet strangely eternal. The ashes of Jacques de Molay still seem to glow in the shadows of time, a reminder that power may fade but stories endure. As you close your eyes tonight, let these echoes of the past rest with you. The knights are gone, the kings are gone, but their footsteps remain in the corridors of history, faint, steady, eternal. Thank you for joining me. Sleep well, and until next time, good night.